So we've created a prototype character. This is essentially just a skeleton, and it will allow us to attach motion capture to a character. Next, I want to attach this to a rig which I can animate. This is a KineFX rig, and its setup will allow me to animate the rig after motion capture has been added. But more importantly, I want an easier rig to animate by hand. Essentially, I'm going to be working with a lot of very poor and very rough animation, where I can focus on timing and poses rather than trying to base the character off existing animation. Once the characters are timed correctly and I know what kind of animations I need, I can then flesh out the animations. Or if I ever get enough money to get equipment to do motion capture, I'll then be able to create animations based off the timings and poses that I need. Essentially, I want to be able to remain open to either hand animation, which is far more common in your Asian countries. Studios in Korea and Japan do a lot more hand animation than what you have in Western studios. If you want to go for a more stylized approach, this is often better in any case. Keeping things simple at the moment will mean that I can decide either way, so I do want to stop using existing motion capture and instead focus more on posing and timing. So this initial rig will allow me to do basic animation, but I will eventually transition into more advanced rigs with better deformation and more flexible features. This is an existing rig which I've already made, and I'm not going to go through how it works now. It's a variant of a basic instructional rig which I created for a Udemy course, so I'll not be going through it here. To create this rig, I'm going to export the components from my character. I'll get a ROP geometry node, and I'm going to export my mesh again. The main reason for doing this is changing the name. I'll call this CHAR mesh, prototype 000. I'll open a new scene, and this scene is going to deal with the rig itself. I'll get 3 geometry nodes. I'll call the first of these geometry. The second will be called guide. And the third will be called rig. I'll enter my geometry and I'll get a file node. In this file node, I'll reference the version of the mesh which I've exported. We can now start working on the guide and the rig. I'll turn off the visibility for all of the nodes at the object level. I can now work on my guide, and I'm going to install some HDAs. Once again, these are rigs which I've previously created. And I've already added these asset libraries to the project under the HDA folder. I'll select all of the HDAs, and I'll install them. I have a couple of libraries which I need to import, mainly for the rig and for the guide. So I'll need to import all of these. I should now have my asset libraries installed. The first node that I'll bring in is a utility node for importing the mesh, and I'll reference my geometry within this node. Essentially, this node allows me to reposition any mesh, as meshes are not always going to be in perfect position for rigging. This will allow me to make small adjustments without touching the original geometry. I'll then get a node which I'm going to use to create my skeleton. This is essentially a guide node, which will allow me to make a humanoid preset. This skeleton was originally based off Tommy, so it should line up with its mesh automatically. For this rig, I'm going to remove all of the fingers, as this character does not yet have any fingers added to it. I can now start setting up the rig. I'll go to the side view and I'll set the viewport to be wireframe. I want to align the character so that the hips and the base of the spine will be at 0 in the Z axis. The spine is further back in the body, although it is more central than people think it is. But with this mesh and the Tommy mesh in general, the spine is actually a little bit behind 0 in the Z axis. So I do want to nudge it forward a little bit. Depending on what engine you have, you'll want to actually have a root bone. In Unreal, this root bone is explicit and it must be at 0 in the world axis, and you generally want the root to be directly below the hips. Unity is far more flexible in this regard. This does not change the fact that you want your hips to be above 0 in the world coordinates, and this will still imply the root with a default position of 0 in the world coordinates. I then have a node which I'm using to attach the weights, as well as a node which I have to build the controls for the rig. I'll then have another utility node which will generate proxy geometry for this mesh. And this will be followed by an export node. Since both the mesh and the default guide here were based off Tommy, all I need to do at the moment is reassemble this, although I could pose this guide to give me a skeleton. I'll call this proxy rig. For the moment, this will be a 0 version of this rig. I then set the export folder, and I set this incorrectly. I should actually create the folder explicitly here rather than just specify the name. This is where Houdini's file system can be a little bit iffy. This works in any case, however it doesn't put it into the specified folder as the folder hasn't been created. I can then export all my geometry. I can now set up the rig. The first utility node is for importing the files for the rig. I've chosen not to embed the files in the rig itself, as this makes it easier to update the files, and if this becomes a serious project, I'll be updating the rigs for a long time to come in any case. This system uses 4 meshes. We will deform either the mesh or the proxy geometry. The deformation will be done by the skeleton, and the rig itself will be controlled by a control geometry set. I'll then bring the rig itself, and I'll connect these. There's one input which I'm not connecting, and that will be for the motion capture, but I won't be using that at the moment. The display for this can show any of the geometry from the rig. Most often I want this to be set to animation, so we can see the final animation for the rig. This rig works with a local and global control system. While this is a rather basic system, I'm actually rather fond of it. Later rigs will replace this with space switching, but there actually are advantages to an explicit local global system. Most of the animation which we're going to be doing here will be done with the local system, and most animation isn't done with IK in any case. IK is generally mainly used for the legs. The spine and the arms will usually be animated with FK. For the head we can use either. I will generally use an IK system for the head. I should now be able to manipulate the rig with the local controls. For this rig I also have universal controls set up. These will affect both IK and FK parts of the rig. And as I said, the legs are generally done with IK in any case, as the feet are almost always a closed chain. Our rig is now moving, and we should be able to display the movement. And I've got a utility display node for this. This makes it easy to animate the rig without having to worry about the mesh, and I can easily switch between the mesh deformation or the proxy deformation. I then have a rig export node. This will allow me to export this for either Unity or Unreal. This is a very basic export, and it doesn't cover things like blend shapes. But blend shapes are not something which I need to deal with yet, and I'm going to primarily focus on bone deformation. And when I get to facial rigs, they'll be bone-based facial rigs. I'll set up the default for my character export. The name will be proxy rig. This will be version 0 of the rig. I've created an FBX folder within my project, and I'll specify this as my destination. I could specify my Unity folder, but I do not want to flood that automatically, so I'll stick with this folder for the moment. I do not have any animations to export, so this should be fine for now. So now I have a basic rig, and I can use this to animate my character.